and when someone closes a door to their spouse and they open a door to someone else. I'm no longer communicating with you,
right? Because
this negative cycle has beat me up where I'm not asking for my wants and needs.
You're listening to Healing Broken Trust podcast with Brad and Morgan Robinson, where we talk about healing from affairs, infidelity, trust, and cheating in your relationship. If you're wanting to heal your marriage, this podcast is for you. We're on episode 10. We're talking about why do people cheat? Why do they cheat? And I think that this one is pretty straightforward. But before we get started, I want to remind you to go to healingbrokentrust.com/episode 10. That's healingbrokentrust.com/episode, the number 10, episode 10. And download those free resources that will really help you to walk through this process to truly heal from what you're going through right now. So let's jump into episode 10 and learn why people cheat.
On our show, we've talked about the different types of affairs, but there is still this looming question of why do people cheat? So, Brad, you want to begin to answer this question for our listeners?
Yeah, Morgan, people cheat. There's 3 primary reasons why people cheat. The first 2 are not that common, and the third is extremely common. The first reason is sometimes people cheat because they're sex addicts. They have a compulsive tendency to act out, and like all addictions, its negative impact on the addict and on family members increases as the disorder progresses. And what I mean by that, as people get deeper into this, it gets worse and worse. Over time, the addict usually has to intensify the addictive behavior to achieve the same results. And let me explain that. When somebody has an addiction, it doesn't satisfy. What you start out doing in the beginning typically doesn't satisfy those urges. So somebody can start with pornography and self-pleasure. A lot of people can stay there who are addicts, but most people will begin to escalate into other things, where they start acting out with other people, they start going to prostitutes, they start seeing escorts, they start acting it out. And so over time, the addict will intensify their addictive behavior to achieve the same results, and that's where some affairs come from.
Right, so that fantasy must then become a reality to further satisfy that addiction.
Yeah, and if you think about it, they've been basically viewing pornography, they've been viewing and breaking down mental barriers that most people have to an affair. They're actually mentally rehearsing an affair when they're viewing pornography. Another thing that's going on is the other type of people who have affairs are the philanderers. And I would say that's more of an attitude than anything else. And this attitude says, there may be something, this attitude of philandering, they believe that cheating is okay for them to do. It's something that guys or girls do. And it's more of a rationalization. It's okay just as long as you don't get caught. Sometimes this attitude says, there's no way a man or woman is supposed to be monogamous.
It's a myth, right?
Yeah, it's a myth. You can't be monogamous.
Right, which is not true. It's not accurate at all. But they believe that.
Yeah, and this kind of attitude can lead to serial cheating and very flirting behavior, especially when their spouse isn't around. The attitude of the philanderer says there is nothing wrong with it. They may rationalize what they are doing or saying to themselves, as long as I'm not having sex with them or intercourse with them, it's okay. So kissing is okay. Spending time with them is okay. Sharing intimate parts of my life is okay because I'm not doing X, Y, or Z with them. And of course, they may even believe sex is okay too. Just don't get caught. And I've had different people tell me before that they viewed having an affair as a rite of passage. And it's something that men do as a part of growing up, as a part of maturing. There's certain
rites of passages.
Yeah, certain rites of passage.
And that's what we see in TV and movies all the time. Oh, you're a virgin? Like that's supposed to be some kind of bad thing.
But there's people like that. There's attitudes that affect someone to have an affair, and we're going to get into that in a little bit later. But most individuals I work with, I would describe them as someone who's burnt out in their marriage.
So that's the third category.
That's the third category.
Most people fit into the third category.
Yeah, and we're going to spend most of our time talking about that. But these are people who are burnt out, and there are attitudes that affect somebody having an affair. And there's those outside influences. Family and friends, have they had an affair? Have your mom and dad had an affair? If they have, you're more likely to have an affair yourself. Are coworkers cheating? What are coworkers' attitudes about infidelity? What was your family's attitude about infidelity? Your friends' attitudes about infidelity? And pornography, like we mentioned earlier, when you're viewing pornography, you are mentally rehearsing an affair. Those are outside influences that affect somebody, make it easier for somebody to cheat. Romance novels, reading that, you're also mentally rehearsing having an affair. A lot of our entertainment, a lot of movies, a lot of different cultural things that we have, they really do not support the idea of monogamy. And they make infidelity attractive, they make it funny, they make it
A
they
normal
make it
part
okay.
of society is what they're
Yeah.
telling us, which is not true.
And you're exactly right about that. So those are attitudes, those are cultural things, those are outside influences that make it that someone can be associated with family, friends, coworkers, viewing pornography, reading romance novels, our entertainment, even celebrity culture. It makes it easier for somebody to cheat. I would even say even certain types of jobs make it easier for people to cheat, especially if you travel for a living. You're in certain professions where it's just easier to cheat. And so affairs really start, Morgan, here, and I want to get into the root of why people cheat. It really starts with the negative cycle that a couple is in. Most couples, I would say, are not happy if they're having an affair. The exception with that may be the philanderers or the sex addicts. I would say almost everybody else, if they're in this burnt out category, they're not happily married if they're cheating. I wouldn't classify that as a good marriage.
Right.
And let me explain the negative cycles, because this is where infidelity starts. There are 3 kinds of negative cycles. There are the first kind, it's the most common kind, and this is a negative cycle where the person who's having the affair is a distancer. They are somebody who is more withdrawn, not very emotionally expressive typically in the relationship.
They avoid.
Right. And they may not start that way in the relationship, though. They may get to that place because they feel like they don't matter to their spouse.
They don't know how to ask for wants and needs.
Yeah.
Right.
They don't know how to get there, and so they may get to that point with their spouse. So they may not start that at that place of being a distancer. They may start at a place of being a pursuer. And a pursuer, and you can go through and listen to our recordings on that. We've talked about that before, so go listen to that. Who are pursuers and who are distancers? But pursuers are the ones who fear being abandoned, fear rejection. They want to be close, and if they don't get it, they'll escalate their attempts for attention and connection into things like blaming, criticizing, demanding. And distancers are people who will kind of shut down emotionally. They will shut down because they don't think engaging with somebody who's upset with them is going to be that productive. And so that's where negative cycles typically start. That's the most basic kind. The person who cheats is a distancer. They're the one distancing from connection.
To the relationship and their spouse, right?
Yeah.
They're more invested in the affair or other things than they are in the relationship at that point, wouldn't you say? Or is that kind of later on?
That's later on, but that's true. But that would happen later on.
Okay.
They become more interested in that. For right now, before the affair even starts, and you can have a pursuer who becomes a distancer. You can have a pursuer who also gets burnt out because they don't feel like they're getting through, and they start shutting down emotionally, and then they have their own affairs. So that's where affairs start, is that you have a negative cycle couples get into. And we've talked about how to get out of negative cycles. We've discussed that. Go listen to that. And so that's where affairs start, Morgan. And every relationship has a negative cycle. And that first one, that's the pursuer-distancer, is the most common type of negative cycle. Then there's a negative cycle where couples are basically fighting all the time.
So they're pursuing, attack.
Yeah, well, the one who's been distancing feels like they're getting attacked by the pursuer, because the pursuer is like, I'm not getting through to you, so they're blaming, criticizing, demanding. You're right, it escalates. Then the distancer feels like they're getting their back against the wall, so they'll attack back, but they're primarily a distancer, and so they're just attacking back.
Can't put baby in a corner, right?
Yeah, and they may be getting resentful as well.
Right.
And so that's the second type. Then the third type is really what I would consider avoid. And these can be looked at as 2 different types of situations, but basically what they do is they avoid each other. And they can avoid each other because they don't like conflict, They don't like stirring things up, and that can be both of them. So the pursuer, even though they want that connection, they're not really criticizing or blaming because they don't like conflict. So they're stuffing what their feelings are.
Mm-hmm.
And then the distancer, they're stuffing what their feelings are and what's going on with them.
And sometimes they think, oh, everything's okay. There's no argument.
Well, exactly. They think they're in a strong marriage. And I got to tell you, a lot of people have affairs in this kind of situation.
Right, where one person is stuffing and they're really not being honest about how they feel.
Mm-hmm. Well, even in the avoid situation, a lot of people have affairs in that.
Right.
And then the other type of avoid affair is an affair where the person who was the original pursuer gets burned out, like I mentioned a moment ago, and they're avoiding, they're distancing, and you have the distancer as well.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the one who was the original pursuer, like I said, they'll get burned out, and they'll distance. Then the one who was the original distancer will see, oh my gosh, they're pulling away from me. I don't like this much distance between us. Then they can become the pursuer.
So they sort of switch roles.
Yeah, they'll switch roles.
Right.
But basically, I'm saying all that to say, we'll not spend a lot of time on that, just to say this. That's where affairs start. They start with a negative cycle because a couple does not feel close.
Mm-hmm.
And people can say they have a good marriage and still have an affair, and I would say for the most part that's probably hogwash, unless there was a sex addiction affair or a philanderer's affair. And the people who are most likely to say that were probably people who were the avoid. Well, we never fought.
Right, so we must have had a good relationship,
Mm-hmm.
but they weren't close to each other emotionally. They just assumed all relationships were like that, typically.
Yeah, we're good because we don't fight.
Right.
They may have good communication skills, but they're not really talking about anything
Of significance.
of significance emotional.
Right.
Their relationship and their feelings, they may be great at communicating about picking up the kids and planning their retirement and things like that,
Right.
but not what's going on between them as a couple.
That deep emotional intimacy.
And so affairs start with the negative cycle. Morgan, this leads into a progression of things that happen, and this doesn't necessarily happen in any chronological order necessarily. These things that I'm discussing, negative cycles create the affairs. Affairs start with a negative cycle, and that leads to the person who's having the affair, who ends up having the affair, feeling like they're burned out, they're tired, they feel beat up by the negative cycle. They end up feeling like they're not good enough for their spouse, and because they're tired, because they're burnt out, because they're beat up by the negative cycle, they don't ask for their wants and needs.
And I think it's very interesting to point out that you say they're beat up by their negative cycle. A lot of people think, well, beat up by my spouse, but no, it's beat up by that negative cycle, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's what's happening between you that's wearing you out.
Mm-hmm. What's happening between you that's wearing you out. It's that negative cycle. And so the spouse will end up not asking for wants and needs.
Mm-hmm.
They stop reaching out. They stop communicating. And what happens is resentment develops. Sometimes they're really angry with their spouse. Just resentment develops. And that's really important because from there, they start feeling alone. They start feeling sad and depressed. They start feeling numb. And what's really happening, Morgan, is they're caring less about their marriage or their relationship. And they're easy fruit for an affair.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's these different things that happen because people get beat up by the negative cycle. Resentment develops, start feeling alone, start feeling sad and depressed, start feeling numb, and they're starting to care less about maintaining that marriage, maintaining that relationship, and they're easy fruit for an affair.
Right.
And the other thing that can happen is they're closed off to their spouse emotionally, and they may be seeking connection elsewhere. So, sometimes people are easy fruit for somebody else to initiate with them.
Right.
But at times, people could be resentful enough where they're going to go initiate with somebody else.
Wow, yeah.
And so that happens as well.
And they begin to rationalize, is that
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Rationalize this connection with a friend who is just a friend or just a coworker.
Well, and Morgan, what's happening is affairs happen when someone closes a door to their spouse and they open a door to someone else. I'm no longer communicating with you
Right.
because this negative cycle has beat me up or I'm not asking for my wants and needs. What happens is closing a door to their spouse and they're opening a door to someone else. And then they're going to share with them. Contact can be made with the affair partner, and sometimes, they've been friends with the affair partner all along.
Right.
So when the betrayer gets involved or the involved spouse gets involved in the affair, it's typically somebody they've known for a while. It's generally not somebody they just met.
Right.
It's not a one-night stand type of thing typically.
Right.
It can be, though. But they have contact with the affair partner. It's somebody that they may have known all along, and the affair makes them feel good about themselves.
Right. If there's depression, it lifts the depression.
If they've been depressed, if they've been feeling alone, if they haven't felt attractive, if they haven't been having sex with their spouse, and they get this attention from somebody else, they begin to feel good about themselves. They like how they feel. And Morgan, like we've talked about before, in understanding why affairs happen, like we've talked about before, in finding meaning, the question to ask to understand why this particular affair happened is to ask, how were you different? And that's generally how people feel about themselves. How did you feel about yourself? How were you different? How did you feel differently? How were you different as a person?
While the affair was happening.
Yeah, while the affair was happening. What did you like about yourself?
Mm-hmm.
Those are all things for people to consider, to talk about, because that's generally what's going on. And so far we have affairs start with a negative cycle that leads people to feeling burnt out, tired, or feel beat up by that negative cycle. They don't feel like they're good enough for their spouse anymore. In a sense, they may already feel rejected by their spouse, maybe even abandoned by their spouse. At times, people do feel that way, and that happens more often than you would think. So they no longer ask for wants and needs. There's resentment there. They start feeling alone. They're sad. They're depressed. They feel numb. And then they start caring less about the marriage. Those are the things that can happen in any order that get people to start caring less about their marriage or relationship. And they're easy fruit for an affair.
Right.
To be picked off or to initiate their own. And they have contact with the affair partner, who may be somebody they've known all along. It may not be somebody new. And what can happen from there is they develop feelings for the affair partner, or they can fall into limerence,
Mm-hmm.
which is a romantic love, love addiction, obsessive love, infatuation.
But it's not based on a reality.
That's not based on a reality.
Right.
It's based on a fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
But then they can develop feelings for that person. And the affair will be going on. It's happening. Once the affair is discovered, it can make it difficult for some people to end the affair once they've been caught, once they've been found out. But that's the general framework of why people have an affair.
Right.
A lot of clients have discussed this with people who've been involved in an affair, and I would say the overwhelming majority of people who've cheated have cheated because of what we talked about just a moment ago, feeling burned out or tired, beat up by the negative cycle. And even they even feel beat up by the negative cycle of avoid because they don't think they matter anymore to their spouse.
Right.
They feel like they're not good enough. They feel like they're not wanted anymore. They have real concerns about it.
Right.
And so they go through this progression, this stage of feeling like they can't communicate, they can't share, their spouse isn't there for them, they're no longer dependable, I can't go to them, they're going to be angry with me, they're going to be upset, somehow I don't make them happy.
Somehow I'll fall short, or
Mm-hmm.
I'll fail, or
Mm-hmm.
I won't measure up
Mm-hmm.
to their expectations.
Yeah. And part of this is, so they go through this series of progression, this psychology of betrayal.
Mm-hmm.
They'll go through the psychology of this mindset of someone who cheats.
Mm-hmm.
They'll have contact with the affair partner. The affair will start. Feelings will develop for the affair partner. The affair will happen and will be happening.
Mm-hmm.
Then once the affair is made known,
Because it always will.
yeah,
Eventually.
yeah, typically it's more often than not it's made known. Then Morgan, once it's made known, for some people, well, almost every couple, there's a period of ambiguity, that uncertainty that they go through.
Right.
Are we going to stay together or are we going to be done?
Mm-hmm.
We'll keep talking about this. Thank you for listening today.
Yes. Have a wonderful week, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Healing Broken Trust.